She crossed the border with a tourist visa, pregnant and alone. She thought she was safe until, hours after giving birth, they took her away in handcuffs directly from the hospital. The worst part? Her daughter remained in a nurse's arms. This isn't just an immigration story. It's an open wound that many prefer to hide. If you enjoy compelling stories, please like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Lucia didn't cross the border chasing the American dream. She crossed seeking survival. When she boarded the plane to the United States, she didn't bring large suitcases or hotel reservations. She carried a small backpack, a passport with a newly approved 6-month tourist visa and a 3-month pregnancy that wasn't yet showing. She was 26, with a tired face and eyes that, though trying to appear strong, betrayed the fear of someone fleeing, not from her country, but from a story that could no longer continue being written. Her last memory of San Salvador was the night she escaped from the house she shared with the man she once thought she loved. The same man who promised her a future, who swore to protect her, and who, as soon as he learned she was pregnant, demanded she get an abortion. When she refused, the threats began, first verbal, then physical, and when she woke one night with the feeling someone was watching her, she found the man in the darkness of the room, knife in hand, his eyes distorted by hatred. That was the sign. There was no choice. She had to leave. She improvised her plan with the little she had, selling an old cell phone, a gold chain inherited from her grandmother, and the washing machine. With that, she paid for the plane ticket, obtained a visa by lying about visiting an aunt in California, and crafted a believable story that she repeated over and over in her mind during the days before the trip. Crossing through immigration was the longest moment of her life. In the airport line in Houston, the air seemed heavier than in San Salvador. She felt every movement was being watched, that every word would be a trap. When the immigration agent reviewed her passport and asked how long she planned to stay, Lucia smiled and said, "About 3 weeks. I want to see Los Angeles and then go back to work." The agent stamped her visa without further questions. Lucia didn't know then, but that was the last moment she could breathe easily. She was received by Maritza, a distant cousin she hadn't seen since they were children. Maritza lived in Riverside, in a small 2-bedroom apartment she shared with her 3 children and a sick grandmother. She offered Lucia the living room couch, some blankets, and a warning. "It's not like back home here. You can't trust anyone. And if you overstay, there's no going back." During the first days, Lucia clung to the idea that her plan was possible. She believed she could work cleaning houses, save just enough, have her baby in a public hospital, and return with what she needed to start a new life. Each morning she got up early, accompanied Maritza to the houses where she worked, and learned quickly to leave everything spotless, to smile without talking too much, to not ask questions. She knew she couldn't sign contracts or have health insurance, but as long as she had strength in her legs and arms, everything would be fine. The pregnancy, however, wasn't so kind. Within a few weeks, she began experiencing strong nausea, dizziness, extreme fatigue. There were days when she couldn't finish work. Clients began asking her not to return. Maritza, though she didn't say it, began looking at her with pity. "I want to help you, but I'm not rich," she would say. And Lucia would nod, her pride increasingly wounded. Time began to become an enemy. When she reached 5 months of pregnancy, she could no longer find work even in restaurants. She slept on the couch without moving too much, ate what she could, and barely went outside. She lived with the constant paranoia that someone would report her, that ICE would find her, that she would end up in a detention center or worse, in jail. Every time she heard sirens, her body tensed. She began taking alternative routes, even to go to the nearest store. She never used public transportation. She kept money in envelopes hidden under the couch cushion. She noted every expense in a notebook. It was a meticulous, almost obsessive routine, marked by the need not to fail. When her visa expired, she simply stopped counting. It was just another date on the calendar that no longer marked life, but fear. Sometimes she dreamed she was back in San Salvador with her daughter in her arms, walking through a park full of trees. In the dream, everything was light and calm. But upon waking, the noise of neighbors, the shouts of Maritza's children, and the smell of reheated soup brought her back to reality. The 6th month arrived like a sentence. There was no turning back. Her belly was impossible to hide. Her body ached. Her soul too. And yet, she never thought of giving up. Sometimes she would caress her belly and speak softly to her baby. "You're going to be born healthy. I promise you. Mom will find a way." Lucia wasn't a criminal. She wasn't an invader. She was a mother fleeing violence, fighting for a piece of peace. But in a system that doesn't forgive expired papers or personal histories, she was already marked. What she didn't know was that, at the end of that road, motherhood wouldn't bring her comfort, but the beginning of her greatest pain. Lucia woke up every morning as if opening her eyes in a minefield. She slept little, poorly, and with her body curled up on the same couch as always. The nights were quieter now. Maritza had changed shifts, and the children spent more time away from home. But that silence wasn't peace. It was constant pressure. A reminder that she was in hiding, that her life in this country had no right to visibility. The date on her passport had already expired. Her visa had expired weeks ago, and with it, the illusion of being legally protected. Lucia became a ghostly presence within the city. She didn't answer calls from unknown numbers. She didn't go out unless strictly necessary. She never looked directly at any police officer. She even avoided security cameras in stores. In her mind, each step she took could be her last. The neighborhood where she lived wasn't dangerous, but it was marked. Many like her lived there. Single mothers, day laborers, newly arrived young people, people who had nothing but risked everything to stay alive. Neighbors looked out for each other but didn't ask questions. They knew that secrets were a form of respect. And in that environment, Lucia learned to move like a shadow. At 7 months pregnant, her body began to fail her. Her legs felt as if they carried stones. Nights were a battle between cramps, sweat, and false contractions. The air mattress she used to rest was no longer enough. Every time she lay down, she felt as if her spine was breaking into 3 pieces. But the hardest part wasn't the physical pain. It was the anxiety that wouldn't go away. A stabbing sensation in her chest, as if something was pulling her from the inside. Fear wouldn't let her think clearly. There were nights when she would sit in the darkness, talking to her daughter through her womb. She asked her to hold on, not to come early, to wait a little longer. In those moments, Lucia mentally reviewed everything she had read on blogs, underground forums, anonymous support groups, stories of women who had given birth alone, with hot water, clean towels, and sterilized knives. Some succeeded, others didn't. Some disappeared. And a few, the most fortunate, managed to bring their children into the world without being caught. She didn't know which of those fates would be hers. One afternoon, while picking up a package of rice at the corner store, she heard 2 men speaking English at the back of the shop. One of them mentioned ice. It was as if the air disappeared. She left the package, went out without paying, and walked 5 blocks without looking back. That night she didn't eat dinner. She couldn't. She was convinced someone had followed her, that her face was already on file. Maritza tried to calm her, but she no longer had time or energy to console anyone. With her 2 jobs and her own family, stress was her daily bread. However, one woman did begin to truly worry about Lucia: Veronica. Veronica was an older, more weathered, more resolute Salvadoran woman. She had crossed the border with her 2 children more than a decade ago. She knew what it was to hide. She knew what it was to give birth in fear. And when she saw Lucia's face one morning, she knew she couldn't stay silent. "How long has it been since a doctor checked you?" she asked firmly. Lucia lowered her gaze. "Since I arrived. What if the baby comes early? What if something's wrong? What if you bleed out?" "I'd rather die than lose her." Veronica swallowed hard. She wasn't accustomed to crying, but something in that response broke her inside. That night, without asking permission, she appeared at the apartment with a pot of soup, a bag of diapers, and her decision already made. "If you don't go to the hospital when it's time, I'll drag you there myself," she warned. "You're not going to die here. You're not going to do that to that little girl." Lucia didn't answer. She just nodded with glassy eyes. She knew Veronica was right, but the terror was too great. The day real labor began, Lucia was alone at home. She felt a sharp tug in her lower abdomen, as if someone was tearing her from inside. She fell to the floor, dragged herself to the couch, and stayed there, curled up, gasping like a wounded animal. She thought it was another false alarm. But after the second contraction, she could no longer get up. She had to call Veronica. She arrived in less than 15 minutes. She found Lucia drenched in sweat, pale, with trembling legs and a soft moan escaping with each breath. There was no discussion. "We're going to the hospital now." "I can't," Lucia stammered. "If they catch me, if I don't take you, you'll die right here." Maritza arrived shortly after. Between the two, they helped her get dressed, put sandals on her feet, and got her into a neighbor's car who asked no questions. He just drove. The city seemed to move in slow motion. The lights, the cars, the signs. Everything was distant noise. Lucia could no longer speak. She kept her eyes closed, praying, feeling each contraction like lightning splitting her body. When they arrived at the hospital, the emergency doors opened without delay. A nurse came out with a stretcher. They put her on immediately, and she disappeared among white hallways and cold lights. They didn't ask for documents. They didn't ask about her status. They just treated her. And for a brief moment, it seemed that everything would be all right. Lucia couldn't remember feeling so much pain. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and metal. The white ceiling lights hurt her eyes. The stretcher she was being transported on creaked with each movement, and every small bump felt amplified in her back. The emergency room was cold, too cold, but sweat was running down her forehead, her neck, her thighs. Her clothes stuck to her body, and her belly seemed about to burst. A young nurse with a Texan accent and a kind voice squeezed her hand. She told her almost there that everything would be fine, that she just needed to breathe. But Lucia couldn't think. She couldn't even speak. The pain was an internal scream that wouldn't come out. "My daughter," she managed to say through clenched teeth. "Don't leave her alone." The nurse didn't respond. She smiled tenderly, not fully understanding. At that moment, no one knew that Lucia had no documents, that she was there violating the conditions of her visa. No one had stopped to check. They were busy saving 2 lives. They quickly moved her to the delivery room. 2 doctors took turns between checking vital signs and preparing equipment. Someone cut her clothes. They put a gown on her. They hooked up an IV. They adjusted her feet to metal stirrups. Everything happened in seconds. Everything was mechanical, hurried, impersonal. Lucia didn't know if she was trembling from cold or fear. Perhaps both. "Full name?" asked a male voice while checking the monitor. "Lucia Fernanda Rivas." Date of birth? October 17th, 1997. The contraction came right after. It was as if her body was splitting in 2. She screamed involuntarily. She felt like her bones were breaking from the hip. Tears flowed on their own. The nurse held her. The doctor told her to push. "One more time, Lucia. Push hard. The head is already coming out." Lucia pushed once, twice, 3 times. She felt like she was fainting. She didn't want to faint. She had to be awake. She had to see her daughter, touch her, tell her her name. And suddenly, the cry, a sharp, fragile, vibrant sound. Her daughter was alive. "It's a girl," announced the doctor, smiling. "She's perfect." Lucia closed her eyes. Her chest was vibrating, her soul too. The pain was still there, but for a few seconds it was less than the emotion. She heard the nurse's voice saying that everything was fine, that they were cleaning her, that now they were going to show her. They placed the baby on her chest. Lucia looked at her as if she were seeing a miracle. She had reddened skin, tiny hands, dark hair, and closed eyes. Her daughter was breathing, trembling, making soft sounds. She was there, alive, in her arms. For a moment, the whole world disappeared. "I'm going to call you Esperanza," she whispered, barely audible, "because that's all I have left." The crying turned to laughter. Lucia didn't understand if she was laughing or crying. She only knew that she had made it, that she had survived, that she had brought her daughter into the world without dying in the attempt. Afterward, the protocol. They took the baby away to clean her thoroughly, to examine her, weigh her, register her. The promise was that in less than an hour, they would return her. Lucia remained under observation, still with an IV in her arm, feeling her legs numb. She could barely move, but she didn't care. All she wanted was to see her again. She didn't know that first hour would also be the last. What Lucia didn't know was that while she was giving birth, a hospital aide, unknowingly, without malice, just following protocol, had entered her information into the system. And when they marked the box, "No health insurance and no social security number," the system automatically activated. In Texas, where the hospital was located, there was a collaboration agreement with ICE. It wasn't a written policy, but reports were frequent. If a patient raised suspicions, immigration authorities were notified. Sometimes a misspelled last name, an empty box, or an anonymous tip was enough. And that tip came. Someone from the hospital itself alerted administration about Lucia's immigration status. There was no identity confirmation, no verification, just a call. It was enough to cross her name with immigration records and see that her visa had expired more than 3 months ago. The system did the rest. At dawn, when Lucia was still weak and in pain, 2 men entered her room. They were tall, dressed in civilian clothes, but wore badges on their belts. One of them carefully closed the door. The other spoke directly. "Lucia Fernanda Rivas?" She nodded, confused, her heart racing. "We're agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You have an active order for irregular stay. We're going to need you to come with us." Lucia didn't understand. What did that mean? Now, after giving birth? "Where is my daughter?" she asked in a low voice, trembling. "She's in neonatology. She's fine, but you need to come with us." "Can I see her? Just for a minute, please?" The men looked at each other. One of them made a gesture of denial. The nurse who was in the room intervened. "Please, she just gave birth. Give her 5 minutes, just 5. The agents allowed it. And so, handcuffed by one wrist with tears in her eyes, Lucia held her daughter for the second and last time. She hugged her with all the strength her body allowed. She whispered in her ear her name, her promise, her love. Afterward, they took her away, and the room was left empty. Lucia never imagined that the purest happiness would last only 5 minutes. When the nurse appeared with a paper in hand and anxious eyes, something changed in the atmosphere. It was as if the air in the room suddenly became dense. Lucia, lying in bed, with the IV still hanging from her arm and the sheet stuck to her body from the sweat of childbirth, knew something wasn't right. The nurse avoided looking at her directly. She muttered that Lucia needed to go to neonatology to sign some papers related to her daughter. Lucia tried to sit up, feeling the weight in her still swollen womb, the burning in her legs, and a sharp pain in her lower back. Her body hurt, as if she had been run over, but that didn't matter. If it was about Esperanza, she would walk with bleeding feet if necessary. "Where is my daughter?" she asked in a hoarse voice, holding onto the bed rail. "She's fine, Mom. You just need to see her now." It wasn't a complete answer. It was a programmed phrase, as if they were reading from a script. But Lucia wasn't thinking clearly. Her mind was numbed by oxytocin, pain, exhaustion, and a presentiment that settled in her chest like a stone. Two men were waiting outside the room. They were dressed in civilian clothes but had badges hanging from their belts. One had a face hardened by years of routine. The other, younger, could barely maintain eye contact. They stood like statues. They made no gestures. They just waited. "Lucia Rivas?" asked the older one. She nodded slowly. She could barely stand. "We have a federal detention order issued by the Department of Homeland Security. Please cooperate. Don't make this harder." The words hit like a slap. Detention. Federal. Homeland Security. Lucia staggered. "My daughter," she murmured with trembling lips. "I just gave birth. I need to see her. Just a moment, I beg you." The agents looked at each other. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. Then, a younger nurse who had been listening from the nursing station approached firmly. "She has the right to see her daughter, even if just for a moment." The older agent breathed deeply, resigned. He wasn't there to bend the rules, just to follow orders. 5 minutes, and we'll have to handcuff you." Lucia lowered her head. She said nothing. She had no strength to argue. A nurse helped her dress in a clean gown. They put a jacket over her so the handcuffs wouldn't show. The journey through the hospital corridors was silent. Nobody spoke, nobody asked, nobody wanted to know. Upon reaching the neonatology area, everything became slower. Lucia entered the room with wobbling legs, arms numbed by the handcuffs, and her heart pounding as if it were about to explode. There, among incubators, tubes, and blankets, she saw her daughter for the second time, and the last. Esperanza was wrapped in a white blanket with blue drawings. She was sleeping deeply. She had pink skin, closed eyes, and a small cotton cap on her head. A monitor marked her heartbeat. Each beep seemed to say, "She's alive, she's alive." Lucia approached the crib with trembling steps. A nurse placed the baby in her arms without a word. The 5 minutes began to count. She held her as if she were made of crystal. Her daughter was so light, so fragile, so small. Lucia's body, still in pain, forgot about the physical suffering. Her soul, in contrast, filled with a love so brutal it split her chest. She kissed her. She caressed her forehead with the back of her fingers. She wrapped her arms around her as if she could hide her from everything that would come after. "You're not to blame for anything, my little girl," she whispered in a broken voice. "Your name is Esperanza, because that's what you are, my only hope." The baby didn't open her eyes, but made a small whimper. Lucia smiled through tears. Her daughter was alive, breathing. She had warmth. She had a heart beating inside that tiny body. But soon, she would no longer be with her. A nurse approached discreetly. She placed her hand on Lucia's shoulder. "Time's up." Lucia nodded, without looking at her. She took off a bracelet she wore on her wrist. It was made of red thread, with 2 small green stones. She had woven it weeks before with scraps of thread she found in Maritza's house. She placed it on the baby with slow movements. "So you know that I am your mother," she said quietly. "Even if you don't see me anymore, even if you grow up without me, you are mine. And I am yours." And then she handed her over. It was the hardest act of her life. Letting her go was like tearing out an organ. The nurse took her gently and placed her back in the incubator. Lucia looked at her one last time, knowing that image would be tattooed in her memory forever. Her baby, with her mouth slightly open, her fingers closed in a fist, and a small red bracelet on her wrist. The agents were already by the door. Lucia left the room without looking back. She knew that if she did, she would break. The tears were no longer discreet. They ran uncontrollably, not from fear, not from anger, but from the brutal emptiness of a mother separated from her child. They put her in an unmarked van with tinted windows. No one on the street noticed anything. No one knew that in that back seat a woman had just lost her baby. No one learned that in that transfer they weren't going to a station, but to seal an official separation. That night, Lucia slept in a cell, with breasts hardened by the milk she couldn't give, and an empty soul. Esperanza stayed at the hospital with a red bracelet and without a mother. The cell had no clock, but Lucia knew it was the early morning hours. She had spent the night without closing her eyes. Her body burned as if her skin was punishing her for every movement. She was still wearing the same hospital gown under the blue uniform they had given her when she arrived. Blood had stained her underwear, but there were no pads, no medical checkups, no one who cared about that. In the detention center, Lucia was just another number on a sheet. There was no mirror, but she felt her face swollen, her lips dry, her hair sticky and loose on her neck. She had asked for a shower. They told her to wait. She had asked for a phone call. They told her to wait. Everything was wait. But her daughter, she couldn't wait. The following noon, an official informed her that she would have her hearing with the immigration judge. They gave her more decent clothes, grey pants, a white sleeveless shirt, plastic shoes. Lucia could barely walk. She felt disoriented, as if everything was happening behind a thick fog. She didn't know if she was awake or trapped in a nightmare that never ended. She was escorted to the court with 5 other women. None spoke. All lowered their heads. Upon arrival, they placed plastic handcuffs on her wrists, not metal this time. It was just protocol. Lucia entered the room. It was small, cold, without windows. The judge, a grey-haired man with an expressionless face, already had an open folder in front of him. Next to him, an official translator. On the other side, a volunteer lawyer, a young man who seemed more nervous than she was. Lucia didn't understand what was happening. She didn't know what words to use. She didn't know the legal terms. When they asked if she had representation, the young lawyer raised his hand and introduced himself as a volunteer defender. "I'm going to speak on her behalf, Your Honor. This woman has just given birth. Her daughter is in the hospital. She has no record. She's only seeking protection. There's no flight risk." The judge flipped through the folder without looking up. Ms. Rivas entered with a tourist visa. The entry date is May 14th. The expiration date, November 14th. Her current situation has been irregular for more than 3 months. "She has a daughter who is a U.S. citizen," insisted the lawyer. "She has no family in her country. She was a victim of domestic violence. She deserves time to appeal." The judge removed his glasses. He finally looked at Lucia. "Is it true that you entered with a tourist visa and didn't leave when the authorized period ended?" Lucia swallowed. "Yes, sir. But I did it to protect my baby." "Is it true that you haven't initiated any asylum process or requested an extension of stay?" "Yes. I didn't know how." The judge sighed. He closed the folder. "The law is clear. Mrs. Rivas violated the terms of her visa. She didn't present asylum documentation. There are no active legal causes. She has an immediate deportation order. Additionally, she is barred from legally entering U.S. territory for 10 years. Lucia felt like she was going to faint. The lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, please. That baby has no other guardian. She's alone in the system. This woman only needs time to arrange custody." The judge didn't interrupt him. He just waited for him to finish. "The minor's case will be evaluated by social services. The deportation stands. This hearing is over." A soft, almost symbolic tap of the gavel marked the end. Lucia didn't understand how she left the room. She didn't remember walking. She only knew that the world had just closed in on her. The 10-year exclusion wasn't just a legal penalty. It was an emotional sentence, an abyss between her and her daughter that she couldn't cross without help. That same afternoon, she was returned to her cell. An officer gave her a paper with the date of her deportation 2 days later. They gave her basic instructions in English, which she barely understood. They asked if she had someone to contact in her country. She gave the number of a distant aunt, though they hadn't spoken in years. When she returned to her cell, Veronica, the same neighbor who had taken her to the hospital, had left a note that managed to slip through the bureaucratic walls. It was a handwritten sheet, carefully folded. "Don't give up, Lucia. I'm going to look for your daughter. You're not alone." Lucia pressed the paper to her chest. It was the only caress she received in those days. 2 days later, they woke her at 4 in the morning. They gave her a packaged breakfast, took her fingerprints, and put her on a bus to the airport. She was still bleeding. She still smelled like the hospital. She still had milk in her breasts. But she no longer had her daughter. The plane took off toward El Salvador. No one on the flight knew that among the passengers was a deported mother without her baby. No one knew that Lucia had been separated from her daughter without a fair trial, without a real opportunity. She carried only a plastic bag with her belongings, a broken bracelet, and a broken promise too. If you're enjoying this story, please like, subscribe to our channel, and activate notifications to stay updated on all our content. Lucia couldn't remember feeling so much shame in her entire life. The plane landed in El Salvador before dawn. Most of the passengers were deportees like her, but no one talked. Some cried silently, others clenched their teeth. Lucia, on the other hand, felt empty. She didn't cry. She didn't feel. It was as if her body functioned by inertia. As she got off the plane, they handed her a plastic bag with her few belongings and a copy of the deportation order. Nothing more. The Salvadoran immigration officials didn't ask many questions. They were used to receiving planes full of expelled citizens. They took their information, gave them bread with cold coffee, and let them out through a side door, away from tourists and the bustle of the airport. Lucia stepped into the humid tropical air without knowing where to go. She had spent so much time imagining that moment, the return to her country, but never in this way. Her original plan was to return with her daughter in her arms, with her head held high, having worked enough to have a foundation and start a new life. Instead, she returned alone, marked, broken. There was no one at the airport for her. No one was waiting. Her mother's address was no longer safe. She had cut all contact when she left for fear of reprisals from the man who had threatened her. And although that man was no longer nearby, fear still clung to her shadow. By instinct, she took an old taxi and asked the driver to take her to the historic center area where an aunt had once lived. She had no certainty if she was still there, but it was the only place she could imagine. When she arrived, the house was abandoned. Broken windows, peeling paint, silence. She knocked several times, but no one answered. She stood in front of the rusted gate, plastic bag in hand, feeling that the country rejected her as much as the previous one. She walked aimlessly down the street, with sunken eyes, aching feet, and a constant buzzing in her ears. She stopped in front of a park and sat on a cement bench. The sky was grey. She had no money, no food, no safe place. For the first time, she felt that she could really disappear without anyone caring. An older woman, selling tamales nearby, looked at her with distrust. But seeing that Lucia could barely stay seated, she approached her. "Are you all right, child?" Lucia didn't know what to say. She just shook her head. The woman gave her a tamale wrapped in a plantain leaf and a bottle of water. "I don't know what happened to you, but you won't survive like this. Over by San Jacinto, there's a shelter for women. Go. They will take you in." Lucia walked more than an hour to find the place. It was a simple building with walls painted white and a blue cross at the entrance. A young volunteer with a tired but kind face received her. They helped her bathe, gave her clean clothes, a plate of rice and beans, and a mattress on the floor next to 5 other women. That night she didn't sleep. She lay looking at the ceiling, in silence. She spent the following days between interviews with social workers, group sessions, community meals, and long walks looking for work. The streets of San Salvador were different from how she remembered them. Noisier, more hostile. Sometimes she crossed paths with men on motorcycles who made vulgar comments. Other times she encountered armed young men who observed her in silence without intervening. Lucia knew how to avoid danger. She knew to stay quiet, keep her eyes down, and keep walking. After several weeks, she got a temporary job at a hostel in the Escalon neighborhood. She washed clothes, cleaned bathrooms, and attended to tourists who came through. One of the managers, a German who spoke broken Spanish, noticed that Lucia had patience for explaining. He asked her to give basic language classes to backpackers. Just the essentials: how to order food, how to ask for directions, how to not die in a market, he joked. Lucia accepted, not for money, but because she needed to occupy her mind. Soon, she began teaching every day in small groups using recycled boards, poorly made drawings, and an enthusiasm she didn't know where it came from. The tourists adored her. They said she had a warm way of teaching. Some asked for private lessons, others left tips. That's how she bought her first used cell phone and paid for a shared internet connection. She learned to send emails, to fill out forms, to contact NGOs. And it was during this process that she heard from Veronica again. The neighbor from Texas wrote her a message through a foundation that helped deported mothers. She told her that Esperanza had been placed in state custody and that she, Veronica, was trying to maintain contact with social services. Lucia printed that email and hung it next to the only photo she had of her daughter. A blurry image where she appeared in a pink blanket with her eyes half open. Each night she lit a candle in front of that image and talked to her. Today I taught a Canadian to say hugs. I wish it had been with you, my love. Lucia didn't have her own home. She didn't have papers. She didn't have promises. But she had a purpose. Esperanza wasn't a memory. She was a destination, and Lucia wasn't going to give up. More than 3,000 kilometers from San Salvador, Esperanza lived surrounded by strangers. After Lucia's deportation, the hospital where she was born notified the Department of Child Protective Services in Texas. The girl, having no registered family member or legal guardian available in U.S. territory, was declared a minor under state custody. The classification was technical, impersonal, but meant the worst: a life without a mother. She was transferred to a foster home on the outskirts of Houston, a modest house that served as a residence for children in situations of abandonment or legal conflict. It was run by a 60-year-old African-American woman named Cheryl, who had raised more than 20 babies in similar situations over the past 2 decades. Cheryl was strict, but warm. Although she couldn't call herself the mother of any of the children who passed through her house, she tried to be as close as possible. She called the baby Baby E while the legal file was being resolved. Whenever she fed her, bathed her, or rocked her, she did it with care, but without attachment. She had learned after many years that these children weren't hers. They belonged to the system, and the system didn't forgive weaknesses. Even so, there was something about Esperanza that touched fibers she didn't know she still had. Maybe it was the way she moved her hands when sleeping, or how she opened her eyes with a calmness that didn't seem of this world. Maybe it was the red bracelet on her wrist, the same one that Cheryl thought about removing several times, but could never touch without feeling a knot in her stomach. Meanwhile, the case continued advancing without noise. Like all cases, another file in a state office with thousands of documents, a name filed under codes, numbers, and dates. No one knew that this baby had a mother who, from another country, was trying to move mountains to reach her. Lucia, in San Salvador, continued sending letters. Letters that took weeks to arrive. Some weren't even answered. Others were filed without notice. She called consulate offices, aid organizations, child advocacy groups. Almost always the answer was the same: "We're reviewing the case, Mrs. Rivas. We'll let you know if there's any news." But the news never came. One day, at the hostel where she worked, she met a freelance journalist. She was a young Mexican woman who was writing a report on express deportations and mothers separated from their children. They talked while sharing a cheap coffee and a rainy afternoon. Lucia had no intention of telling her anything. At first, she just listened. But the journalist, named Sophia, had a way of asking without pressuring. It was clear she wasn't looking for sensationalism, but truth. Lucia felt seen for the first time in a long time, and she spoke. She told her everything. From the day she fled San Salvador, the pregnancy in the United States, the birth, the detention at the hospital, the 5 minutes with her daughter, the cell, the deportation. Everything. Sophia took notes without interrupting. In the end, she asked for a photo. Lucia gave her the blurry copy she had hanging next to the candle. "It's the only one I have," she said. "And if you can do something with this, do it." That night, Sophia wrote the article. She titled it, "The Mother Who Only Had 5 Minutes." She published it in a digital media outlet with circulation throughout Latin America and shared it on her social networks. In less than 48 hours, the text went viral. Thousands of people began to comment, share, write messages, tag authorities, congressmen, international organizations. Lucia didn't know what was happening until, 2 days later, her old cell phone began to ring non-stop. She received emails from lawyers, messages from journalists, calls from activists. A tide had begun, one she hadn't sought, but that now offered her a possibility. An NGO based in Los Angeles offered to represent her legally. They explained that, although the deportation was final, they could initiate an international custody process so that at least she would be recognized as the biological mother with the right to contact and communication. It was complex, long, full of obstacles, but it was something Lucia accepted without thinking. During the following weeks, she worked double shifts to be able to print documents, pay for internet, send forms, translate files. Sophia helped her with communications. Veronica from Texas became a bridge between her and social services. Cheryl, Esperanza's caregiver, also began to ask more questions. She wanted to know why this child still didn't have a clear resolution, and why no one was responding to such a persistent mother. Finally, the first concrete sign arrived. An official letter from the state of Texas authorizing Lucia to maintain weekly video calls with her daughter. It wasn't what she dreamed of. It wasn't having her in her arms, but it was something. It was the beginning of something. The first video call was on a Saturday afternoon. The screen took time to load. Lucia had prepared as if she were going to a job interview. She combed her hair carefully, put on a clean blouse, and placed Esperanza's photo behind the computer. When the image of the baby finally appeared, held by Cheryl in her lap, Lucia couldn't contain her tears. "Hello, my love," she said with a trembling voice. "It's Mommy." Esperanza, barely a year old, didn't understand the words, but she looked at the screen with those big, dark eyes and smiled. Lucia, on the other side, clung to that smile as if it were a promise. Sophia's article had been just a spark, but one spark was enough to ignite a fire. The Mother Who Only Had 5 Minutes. The title read in bold, accompanied by the pixelated image of Lucia with a broken gaze and a red bracelet in her hand. The story was simple and brutal. A Salvadoran woman detained after giving birth, deported without her daughter, and forced to rebuild her life thousands of miles away while her baby grew up in a country that wasn't hers. Surrounded by people who didn't speak her language, who didn't know her real name, nor the story of love and loss that had brought her into the world. The text was published on a Friday night. By Sunday noon, it had already accumulated more than 100,000 shares. The reaction was immediate. Some cried reading it, others felt rage. Many, for the first time, put a face to one of the thousands of stories that normally remain buried in statistics and cold files. What impacted most wasn't just the injustice of the system, but the humanity with which Lucia was portrayed, not as an illegal, not as a threat, but as a mother with a torn heart. Sophia's account filled with messages. Some offered legal help, others contacts within international organizations, others simply words of support for Lucia. Most asked the same: where is the baby? What's her name? Why isn't anyone doing anything? Within days, the pressure began to be felt. A collective of migrant women organized a social media campaign. Esperanza has a mother. They created an account dedicated exclusively to the case. They uploaded fragments of the article, excerpts from Lucia's letters, screenshots of calls with her daughter. Each post was an emotional blow, and each blow added strength. The journalist Sophia, for her part, didn't stop. She was invited to television programs, podcasts, analysis panels. She spoke with human rights organizations, Latino congressmen in the United States, lawyers specializing in international custody. Everyone wanted to know more. Everyone wanted to help. But they all said the same thing: the process would be long, and nothing was guaranteed. Lucia became, without wanting to, a symbol. From her room in San Salvador, she followed each development with wide eyes and a tight stomach. Sophia informed her of each step, each public mention, each door that opened, or at least was no longer completely closed. But Lucia didn't get carried away by euphoria. "I don't want to be famous," she told her one night over a video call. "I just want my daughter. And that's why we're doing this," Sophia replied. "Because there are thousands like you, but you spoke, you broke the silence." The campaign account received an anonymous donation that allowed them to hire a specialist in international family law. He was a man of Cuban origin who worked from New York. His name was Ramiro Estevez. He had worked on similar cases, but never with one that had so much public visibility from the start. "We're going to move this from the legal and the political fronts," he promised Lucia. "I don't guarantee anything, but we won't let them erase you as a mother." Ramiro and his team initiated a new formal process before the family court of Texas. A trial was requested to determine the best interest of the minor, considering the emotional bonds with the biological mother. The case was complex. Lucia had no legal residence in the United States, had been deported with an exclusion order, and her daughter was already under state protection. Even so, the law allowed for the possibility of family reunification at a distance if adequate conditions of the maternal environment and explicit willingness to maintain the bond were demonstrated. Lucia underwent psychological evaluations, presented proof of income, signed sworn statements, submitted to interviews with Salvadoran social workers. Whatever they asked, she did without complaining. Each document, each stamp, each signature was another stone placed on the bridge that separated her from her daughter. Meanwhile, Cheryl, Esperanza's caregiver, began to notice changes. The baby reacted with joy every time she saw Lucia on video calls. She babbled sounds similar to Mama, clapped her hands, smiled. It was evident that the connection hadn't been lost. "She recognizes you," Cheryl told her on a call. "It's not just a screen. You're her mom, and she knows it." Lucia hung up those calls with a full heart, but also with an anxiety that wouldn't let her sleep. Each smile was a blessing and a torture. Sophia, for her part, decided to take another step. She asked Lucia to write a public letter, not a legal statement, but something more human. A letter to her daughter, a message that could reach any mother, any heart. Lucia took 3 days to write it. She did it in her old notebook, the same one where she noted English phrases. The letter spoke of love, of pain, of struggle. It didn't mention laws or judges or politics. It only said what a mother who cannot hug her daughter feels. "My little girl, every night I ask God that you don't forget me. I don't forget you. Every day I get up so that someday you can call me Mom, in person, not through a screen." The letter was published on social media with an image of the red bracelet. and it exploded. Thousands shared it. It was translated into English, French, German. It was read in churches, in schools, at public events. It even reached the desk of a US senator of Latin origin who decided to personally intervene in the case. Lucia couldn't believe it. The letter she wrote, crying, thinking no one would read it, was going around the world. For the first time since that delivery room, she felt she wasn't alone. What began as a letter became an echo that wouldn't stop resonating. That simple and sincere text, handwritten in a worn notebook, crossed borders, languages, and screens. It was a mother's voice, raw and unadorned, pleading for her daughter. And that voice, so real, did what hundreds of emails and legal files hadn't achieved. It sensitized those who had the power to decide. Days after publication, the US senator who had read the letter requested a special hearing with representatives from the Texas Department of Child Protective Services. She argued that Lucia's case was not only legally debatable, but ethically urgent. A mother deported without a fair trial, a US citizen minor with no connection to her country of origin, and an evident emotional bond documented through regular video calls. "We're not talking about a mother who abandoned," said the senator in front of national news cameras. "We're talking about a mother who was torn away, and that cannot be ignored." And that same day, Lucia was called via video call from an office of the US consulate in San Salvador. The connection was bad, but her heart was beating so hard that she could barely hear anything else. On the other side, Ramiro, her lawyer, was smiling like never before. "Lucia, the international custody process has been opened. It's not adoption. It's not limited visitation. It's an evaluation to legally establish you as a responsible mother from El Salvador." Lucia didn't know what to say. She had been expecting bad news for so long that for an instant she thought she had misheard. "Does that mean that I can be recognized as her mom, even if I'm not there?" "That means you're in the system. You're no longer outside, and that changes everything." From that moment, Esperanza's case was assigned to a new social worker, bilingual, trained in cross-border reunification processes. She began to communicate directly with Lucia, through emails and calls, asking questions about her daily life, her environment, her income, her emotional stability. Lucia answered everything honestly. She showed the room where she lived, the books she used to teach Spanish, the computer she used for online classes. She talked about her routines, regular doctor visits, how she had learned to stay strong with nothing. Each answer was a piece of herself, reconstructed in front of a screen. Video calls with Esperanza increased from once a week to twice. Cheryl, the caregiver, noticed that the child looked forward to these connections. She became restless near the agreed time. She shouted unintelligible sounds, but full of emotion, when she saw her mother's face appear on the screen. "She already says mama," Cheryl told her one day. "She says it clearly. I don't know if she understands what it means, but she says it when she sees your face." Lucia put her hands to her mouth to contain her crying. From the hostel where she worked, her colleagues began to notice the change. She walked more upright. She smiled occasionally. There was a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been seen in months. Tourists asked about her story, and for the first time she told it without crumbling, no longer as a tragedy, but as a struggle in progress. Meanwhile, social networks remained active. Sophia, the journalist, weekly updated the account with small advances. Lucia had her third video call. Esperanza is already walking. The custody application has been accepted for final review. Each post received hundreds of supportive comments. People from different parts of the world sent messages, drawings, even stuffed animals by mail with letters addressed to Esperanza. In one of the packages, a stuffed animal arrived with a recording inside. When pressed, Lucia's voice could be heard saying, "I love you, daughter. Mom is with you, always." Cheryl placed the stuffed animal in the crib. The child pressed it every night before sleeping. For the first time, Lucia felt that time wasn't just passing to take things away from her. It was also passing to build. She had learned to live from a distance without the love weakening. She had managed to shout her story in the midst of a world that normally only listens to what it wants. She still couldn't return to the United States. The 10-year exclusion order was still in effect, and there were still many procedures to go through. But something had changed. Now there was an official file where she was recognized as a mother. She was no longer a legal disappearance. She was a presence. The international reunification process was still underway. The judge assigned to the case had requested psychological reports, community references, and periodic follow-ups by the social worker. Cheryl had testified in favor of Lucia. Lawyer Ramiro was convinced it was just a matter of time. Lucia, however, didn't allow herself to dream too much. She had learned that hope must walk with feet on the ground. But every time her daughter said "Mama" in front of a screen, something broke inside her. And at the same time, another part was rebuilt. She knew the road was still long, but now she wasn't walking it alone. Lucia no longer counted the days. She learned that in waiting there is no logic, only faith. That there are clocks that don't mark hours, but resistance. Each morning she woke up in the same modest room as always. Peeling walls, a window that barely let in the sun, a shelf with used books, an extinguished candle, and, above everything, the same blurry photograph of her daughter. Esperanza was almost 2 years old now. In each video call, Lucia saw her change. Her hair grew, her gaze became more attentive, her voice filled with new sounds. Sometimes she found her eating with her fingers, other times dancing to a children's song, always with the stuffed animal that played her recorded voice. Lucia greeted her with a mixture of joy and pain. Sometimes she laughed, sometimes she cried, and always, at the end, she said the same phrase, "Mom is here. Even if I can't hug you, I'm with you." She never missed a video call. She never disconnected early. She never stopped fighting. From San Salvador, she continued working at the hostel in the mornings and translating documents in the afternoons. She saved every dollar. Sometimes she fasted to save more. Each cent had a destination: lawyers, paperwork, connections, certificates. She also sent letters to the Texas court with drawings, songs in Spanish, recordings. She wanted her daughter to know who she was, not just by blood, but by presence. The social worker in Texas named Emily was key. She, more than anyone, understood that this case wasn't just legal. It was human. She traveled twice to San Salvador to interview Lucia in person. She ate in her small room, met her neighbors, attended one of her classes with tourists. She saw how she talked about her daughter without her voice clouding. "Your environment is simple," she told her on one occasion, "but it's full of love. That's what matters most." A few months later, lawyer Ramiro notified her that the judge in the case had issued a preliminary ruling. He recognized Lucia as the biological mother with rights to direct communication and the future possibility of requesting custody on U.S. soil if legal conditions allowed it. In simple words, she still couldn't get her back, but she was no longer invisible. It was a huge step. From that day, Lucia began receiving monthly reports on Esperanza's development. Medical information, educational updates, recent photos, emotional assessments. Each document was like a drop of water in the middle of the desert. And although she couldn't be physically with her, she knew her daughter was growing up with care, with follow-up, with respect for her roots. Cheryl, the caregiver, remained committed. She sent spontaneous videos, Esperanza singing in a low voice, playing with other children, looking at an illustrated book with letters in Spanish, always with the red bracelet on her wrist, though it was already tight on her. Lucia, for her part, didn't seek to replace what was lost. She didn't want to form a new family or fill the void with another life. Her love was singular, directed toward a single being. And although she knew the story would be long, complicated, and without guarantees, she remained firm. Sometimes she was invited to give talks at small community gatherings. Other times she was contacted by journalists for interviews. She no longer hid. She spoke without fear, not for fame, but because she had understood that her story wasn't just hers. It was also that of hundreds, perhaps thousands, who were never heard. Sophia, the journalist who started it all, remained by her side. She became a friend, a sister, an accomplice. Together they created a small aid fund for deported mothers, which they called Minutes with Esperanza, in honor of the 5 minutes that forever marked Lucia's life. One October night, near her daughter's birthday, Lucia received a call from the United States. It wasn't Emily, it wasn't Ramiro, it was Cheryl. She was crying. "Lucia, I just want you to know that today, for the first time, she asked about you with clear words. She said to me, 'Where's Mommy?' Lucia remained silent. She couldn't respond. She just breathed heavily, as if that moment gave back to her all the years that had been stolen from her. Finally, she said, Tell her that Mommy is waiting for her, that one day we'll be together, and that no matter how long it takes, I will never leave her heart." She hung up the call and stared at the lit candle. She no longer cried. She no longer trembled. She sat at the computer, opened a new document, and began to write a new letter, not to a court, not to a judge, not to the government, but to her daughter, with simple words, like those she teaches in her classes, words that a child can understand. "My love, I still can't hug you, but every day I get a little closer. When you grow up and read all this, I want you to know that I didn't give up, because you are worth everything." She closed the file, saved it with the date, and smiled. Lucia was still in the same room, in the same city, with the same limited resources, but she was no longer the same woman. Now she was a recognized mother, a woman with a voice, a story with impact. She didn't know when she would embrace her daughter again, but she did know one thing with certainty. There was something that no one, no system, no wall, no judge could ever take away from her. Her right to love, her right to hope, and her right to fight. Because the name she whispered at birth became the destiny she chose to live, Esperanza. And if you like this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate notifications. Until next time.